Hello and welcome to tonight's Moral Economy podcast. I am Navaz, one of your hosts.
I'm Eddie, one of your other hosts.
I'm Chell. I'm also a host.
And I'm Frat. I'm also another host.
And I'm Andrew. I am also a host.
I want to quickly say that it's our 10th podcast. So congrats, guys.
So,
We
yeah,
did
yeah,
10
okay,
podcasts.
I guess
And
Congrats for us.
we didn't plan this, but all five of us are here. I think this is the first time we have all five of us together.
I sort of planned it. I mean, I kind of
Okay.
said, be here because it's going to be the 10th one.
And it's the last one for the year.
Oh yeah,
And
So-
this will be the last one for the year, right? Because two of us are going away for a very long time. Chell and Eddie.
Not that long.
yeah. Too long. It's a
3.5
long time.
weeks, yeah.
It's a long time.
Yeah.
3 weeks.
3 weeks is an eternity.
And I don't know what the rest are doing.
So we'd start with the most recent happenings. It's been a very interesting weekend, more so in France, where it was the center of action. The regional elections, the climate change conference. We begin with the regional elections. And France has apparently avoided what its prime minister has called the danger of extreme right. Yes, the danger. The danger was posed by the right-wing party of Front National, or the National Front, as we call it in English. It did come out as the most polled political party in the first round of regional elections. Just for those of you who don't have a background in French political structure, regions are the basic territories in France, and they are the topmost topmost tier of local administration. And under there are the communities, the communes, and the administrative divisions. Now, this regional election is also sort of game-changing in the sense that France, until now, has 22 regions, but as of next year, it's going to be 13. So a lot of regions are going to be. This is continental France, not its overseas territories. They're going to be lumped into 13 regions, and the Front National, as of December 6th, was leading in 6 regions. And that sent a scare to the French political establishment, both mainstream parties, the ruling socialists, and the former President Sarkozy's Republican Party.
Which is a Goy's party.
Yeah, which is a more centre-right party, but
Monarchist, basically.
yeah, but they've been mainly, taking turns in ruling France since the creation of the Fifth Republic in 1968 by de Gaulle himself. Okay, not the problem really. What was surprising and what was scary was that for the first time in the history of Front National, Front National, it came out to be the topmost party in those 6 regions, and it stood a major chance of an electoral victory by beating up xenophobic, anti-Islamist, anti-immigrant, and nationalistic sentiment as a wake of the Paris attacks that happened on November the 30th. And then, thanks to tactical voting by the 2 establishment parties, what we saw was an aversion of this danger of extreme right. But eventually, as the results show, that the socialists managed to get 5 of the 13 regions. President Sarkozy's party, Republicans, got about 7 of them, and one of them is probably backed by an independent candidate without any party representation. But the scare of the extreme right, it remains in France, in the land of liberty, equality, and fraternity. A xenophobic, nationalistic, anti-immigrant, anti-Euro party is coming out as a political alternative, is something that deserves serious thought. Polls show that it tends to be popular among younger people and those with low levels of education. But they also show that it has grown its reach in areas of inequality. It has been on the rise since the European elections in last summer, and earlier local council elections earlier this year. And a recent poll by the BVA suggested that 57% of the French people now feel that the Front National should be considered as a party like the other 2 mainstream parties, and its voters can no longer be confined to a particular stereotype. Now, what I see problematic is this: the rise of the FN is not just isolated to France. It's a general tendency towards rise of nationalist politics since the turn of the century. Be it prosperous nations of the north, such as France, Sweden, Netherlands, and the developing countries of the south, Turkey, India, Brazil, Egypt. The 21st century has seen a steady rise in right-wing nationalism. In France's case, and one could also generalize this to an extent, is that one can blame economic stagnation, high unemployment, a general disconnect with the political class, which provides a steady base for such right-wing populism. And it's parties like the National Front who touch base with the segments of the society who have borne the brunt of globalization that has been on the aggressive in the last 30, 40 years. And it's by beating up nationalist agendas that parties like the National Front came to save and salvage all things that French from the high-handedness of the EU and the scourge of immigrants, read Muslims or whatever. But how they do is most mundane. It's by villainizing the other that lives in France and the other that lives elsewhere. It is this villainizing of the other that is rather easy to do and resonates with the masses as well. And more so if France happens to be the theater of the most recent theater of international terrorism. But what plagues this sort of narrative is its self-obsession, if not its outright ignorance. Now, Madame Le Pen and those of her like should well know that the individual can no longer be localized. With economic globalization, we have also political globalization and more globalization as well. Now, this political and more globalization has made the individual as a subject of international concern, and the individual is now global. So, instead of appealing to old identities, which are divisive, I believe, we should create new identities for ourselves. These new entities could be cosmopolitan. We all human beings, partake in global citizenship. We all are citizens of the world, irrespective of whatever primary citizenships we may hold. And this rise of the right confronts multiculturalism as a normative description of the liberal social order. It shows how ineffective multiculturalism has been as it's been practiced in the liberal societies of Northern Europe. And there's a need to understand and develop concepts like pluralism, interculturalism, and other similar frameworks that help us better understand the self and the other relationships. And I think there's nowhere better to start with this than in the land of Jacques Derrida, who once called for hospitality beyond hospitality and tolerance beyond tolerance. That was sort of a roundup of what was happening in France. I think it was more because of the tactical voting and an aggressive campaign by the main establishment parties that somehow kept the right-wing National Front at bay. But still, what is unsettling and what is more surprising is that this party has come out to be in the mainstream. It is appealing to people, which is why it's got 30% of the vote, and which would also make things scary that in 2017 France goes to polls, and if Madame Le Pen can get into the second round, she can probably create one of the scars that her father created in 2002 when Jacques Chirac had to rally both the parties to get support to be able to get to
in the election in the first round. If I'm not mistaken, Front National got around 18% of the votes, and that was already a shock in itself.
No, they got 30%, 28%.
No, against Chirac, when Le Pen
Oh
was
yeah,
running against Chirac.
exactly. That was 82% for Chirac and 18% for Le Pen. Yeah.
That was already a big shock in itself. That
Exactly.
figure, the godfather of the entire Front National movement, could gather so much support for a big figure as Chirac.
True. Which is what makes it more unsettling that this is now somehow
they increased their vote to 30%, and that's not even big news anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I just know that they're the radical right, but what do they propose? What is so appealing other than the fear mongering that's, of course, as a result of the Paris attacks?
It's just not the Paris attacks. It's the Front National has rallied support over the past 20 years. It's
What are his policies?
Marine Le Pen has brushed off the anti-Semitic racist past that she had disagreements with her father, and only I think in May this year, her father was expelled from the party, and now she's the leader of the party. Before that, it was her father.
Just to look a little cute.
Yeah. But it does, like I said, France has record unemployment. I don't know, somewhere between 12%, and more so in regions where it got most of the votes in the northern regions of the country, and it's just somehow playing the nationalistic card in the sense that they've surrendered their sovereignty to the EU. There's a lot of globalization happening. Jobs are being going outside. Jobs are being going outside of France.
So they're presenting the alternative to capitalism through its.
I mean, insofar as they want to correct globalization, the argument, like I said, it could be. It is if as long as she argues against international capitalism, and how people have been left out of it, that is different. But then rallying up masses against the other, like I said, how you present the other is what's problematic, and
Exactly.
she presents her party herself as representing the voice of the true French people.
How's the relationship with unions and these kind of things? The National Front. Do you know? Does anyone know?
I don't know if they have any unions that are part of their movement, but they are basically against these. For example, take EU. They don't want EU.
Yeah.
They want to get out. And Nawaz made a good point that they are against globalization not only economically but also culturally or socially. They want to stay French or whatever that means for them.
Which plays a big role in French culture. Right?
And they're also extremely conservative. Even more interesting is the 23, 24 something years old niece of Marine Le Pen, I think,
exactly.
who is also much more favored by the grandfather Le Pen. What was his name?
Jean-Marie.
Jean-Marie
Le Pen.
Jean-Marie Le Pen. It's one of his granddaughters.
Yeah.
She is a much conservative figure,
Yeah.
and she's becoming much more popular among the French people, not only among the French right, but also among the larger French population.
And I saw her; she's like in her mid-30s, late 30s.
She is 26. She is
No,
24.
she's below 25.
Yeah. She's 26, I think.
Marion
25, 26.
Marion Maréchal Le Pen.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And people are expecting that in a couple of years she is going to take over the Front National, and that it's just going to be another level.
What's more interesting is she's come out. I mean, she's made in one of her press conferences. She's come out and say that Muslims don't belong in France because France
She's
has
much more
traditional Christian values, and which the Muslim populations of France cannot, respect, adhere to, or understand. Which is why, her aunt somehow made a comparison between Muslims praying in the street to the Nazi occupation of France back in the day.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, so which just tells you,
it's an inversion.
Yeah, which just tells you what sort of a hate mongering is going on over there, and which is why I think this I see it as not just being restricted to France. It's growing elsewhere as well. It's growing in Netherlands. It's growing in Sweden. It's growing as countries Slovenia, Poland, for example, right now. Poland has an extreme right government come in, which was voted in a couple last month or.
Hungary too, for already.
Even Hungary. Viktor Orban has presented today himself as to be the next prime minister candidate as well. So it's really not just something that you'd point out just to the French and say, okay, this is French problem. It's a problem.
You just wouldn't think it would happen to France, as you pointed out. The land of liberty, equality, fraternity, right?
And the Republican values that the French people have stood for. Which again, in this particular example, it just tells you that she's been kept out of power. This just somehow shows you that there's a scare within the political circles of France, and both the mainstream parties, they shunned their whatever differences that they had, and pulled up candidates against her, so as to that she presents the main threat to both the parties and to the general political establishment in France,
which is a perfect push for the mainstream party.
Again, definitely. They come out more emboldened. She and the nephew, she only today, I think yesterday after the poll, she came out with the statement that there are victories which shame the victors.
Yeah.
You know, so they still are riding on the high moral ground of somehow, you know, the rules of the game being changed
Yeah.
in that sense that, you know, both the
And they
parties
changed the
can-
game basically.
Yeah, yeah.
It was reported that the only reason the second rounds they didn't get any seats was because, and we spoke about this earlier, because of tactical
Yeah.
voting.
So in the main 6 regions where they were
How
leading,
does that work?
it works in the sense that in the main 6 regions where they were leading, the socialists and the Republicans made an arrangement themselves that one of the parties, they withdrew their candidate, so as to people had a binary choice between Marine Le Pen or one of the consensus candidates of the other two parties.
And so
Yeah.
they withdrew the weaker one, probably.
Yeah, yeah. But also surprising, the socialists, for the first time in history, have lost Ile-de-France, the
Paris
metropolitan
is-
region of Paris, which is now being backed by the Sarkozy's party, the centre-right Republicans.
Wow.
Yeah,
I mean, this is an old leftist
which is somehow shows you that how the political debate has, you know, centered itself towards the right, and both the parties, even the socialists, you know, they've drawn their agenda from the Paris attacks on the 13th of November.
They are forced to because
Yeah.
there is such a big shift. To
Exactly.
The right. I mean, Sarkozy is basically he's just feeding off of this shift to the right.
Well, I'd like to use this point, like this shift to the right. You know, it's something that we've seen generally, not just in France, but in many countries. In the United States, it's been happening for over 30 years as well. And I want to like maybe shift the conversation to the reasons for it. And we clearly understand that these are economic reasons mostly. But you've mentioned that Front National is against the EU, for instance, and they want to get out of the EU. In Spain, there's also a lot of discontent with the EU, and in a lot of countries, there's a lot of discontent with the EU, and they see it as responsible economically for their situations, which, you know, it's not a very bad
unfair
analogy.
characterization.
Yeah, it's not unfair to say that as well. And I want to sort of like also, but the reason sort of we get involved with this is, as you were saying, the hatred of the other, right? And who's this other that they're hating? It's mostly Middle Eastern people who are coming in from the Middle East and from war-torn areas like Syria. The major increase has been recently, and I want to sort of point out, you know, these same sort of economic things that are happening in Europe have also influenced the reasons that the Middle East is unstable. And also not only in Europe but also in the United States. And so it sort of has this driving a two-pronged function. You have on the one hand, you know, the lessening economic conditions, the worsening economic conditions in these countries due to, you know, bad policies, conservatives getting in, you know, messing with things, transnational corporations lobbying and stuff like that. And that creates, you know, a big group of very dissatisfied people who then swing to the right, and who they then attack the very same people that, you know, these countries enable to come into the country in order to work for lower wages and stuff like that. And I wanted to tie those things together.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, that's the most standard answer you get, that, you know, there is economic stagnation, there is misery, there is joblessness. So what people are more attracted to is there's a disconnect between the political and the individual. You know, they think that the political classes are not representing them as such, in terms of, you know, their negotiations with trade negotiations, their negotiations with the EU, in France's case. But what's really saddening is that, you know, why is right filling that alternative? You know, in Marxist theory, something like this sort of a crisis would be, you know, a cry to the left as well. And there has been, like in Greece and Spain. In Greece and Spain are two good
And the
examples.
US as well with Sanders. You know,
with Bernie Sanders,
right?
of course.
And so why not in France?
Because the socialists are ruling, and which is why this makes it more pertinent to talk about France in the sense where the whole goalpost is being, you know, shifting to the right.
Yeah. It's already a left
Yeah,
party.
the
Supposed
party
to be
that
left
rules
party.
That's
currently-
not, it's not a leftist party.
But-
It is a socialist party, but of course
But
it
it's
is.
traditionally left
It has-
party.
It has
in
changed
France.
itself
Yeah, so-
from.
It represents the left
It's like the American Democratic Party, which is presented
Yeah.
as the left,
Yeah,
but it's not really
yeah,
the
but
left.
yeah, but the whole
Yeah.
point is that if your left is already in the center, then
Exactly.
you tack right, like
Yeah,
because
exactly.
there's no group in the left, even further left,
Yeah.
in order
But
to
that's the
take
thing,
in.
why isn't there a more radical left in
There
France?
is a radical leftist group in France, but they like I said, they're not one of the more traditional parties that would. There's an ultra-Marxist party. I'm forgetting the name. I was reading about them. They exist over there. France is it's probably seen as one of the major two-party contests, but it's not. There is other parties over there.
But
There's even a
this is also another point.
ecological green party, but they serve as as coalition partners to the current Hollande government, for example, as well.
So what has the National Front done that the radical left-wing governments, parties haven't done? That's my curiosity, I guess. What have they been able to monopolize in political discourse
Well,
that has allowed them to get all of these votes and attention that a radical leftist party hasn't been able to monopolize? Because they're making the same argument. I mean, they're saying the thing. Look, you're being, globalization is leading to this horrible unemployment. You're being, taken advantage of, exploited. These are the kind of typical things a leftist party would say. But the right is doing.
Actually, I have a point to make here. Professor Wolff, Richard Wolff, the one who advocates WSCDEs, worker self-directed enterprises, basically communism on a micro scale. He points out that actually he's been invited by right-wing talk show hosts to also discuss the problems of the economic system. So, to a certain extent, these sort of leftist ideas of worker ownership and having less consolidation of power in the hands of corporations resonate also on the right. And so perhaps to explain or to answer your question, is the right also resonates this to a certain extent, and now we just have a certain political time period where the right is the one that is in position to take it over as well.
Yeah, and it just goes to show that traditional identities that we have of like what's the standard leftist party, what's the standard rightist party, they don't really apply anymore. That these identities are very elusive and they could kind of change and take up. You could have like eco-fascists maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, but
I think what makes this really interesting is the fact that if the left and the right both have the same enemies, transnational, multinational corporations, big governments, supra-government entities, EU, UN, what have you.
The Tea Party.
Then, yeah, exactly. Then, there is something wrong with the left, that the left has not been able to gather momentum in countries like France. Well, I mean, I understand that there is a socialist party ruling the country, but this socialist party is very different from what was elected in 1981 when Mitterrand was elected to power. They privatized and they went back with that privatization.
Well, where's the revolutionary power of the left, right? Like
exactly.
I mean, it's like
That is
the left
should be
joined mainstream politics
the
and has suffered an erosion of revolutionary potential over the last 80 years or something, and whereas the right doesn't have that. The right feels revolutionary to the angry young people who are so drawn to it. And of course, there's also the fact that the right has clear and easy enemies. They have and clear and easy sort of narratives. You say, I'm French and Muslims are bad.
Yeah.
And you see Muslims, you see them around. And
Exactly.
also you go to the store where maybe you applied for a job, the old they took our jobs thing, and maybe there's a Muslim kid working there and you're like, man, I wanted that job, and like what about poor French people? We should be first pick, and then this is much easier than saying, okay, the enemies are the capitalists over there somewhere far away, and it's less.
I think it's very important to point out or remember that the traditional establishment left has been very complicit in the economic policies that have created this situation.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, and this is obviously just capital's way of being able to appropriate, different elements of things and incorporate it into its own.
Yeah.
But the traditional left has always been very complicit in these sort of liberal economic policies, and when they go bad, we see the left as being responsible for it. So I think this tag to the right is actually rather, something that was going to happen.
Yeah, that is what Fukuyama told us at the break of the Soviet Union, that that is the
End of history.
end of the history, and global democracy and free market are there to stay. So either you somehow shape up with that or ship out. I don't know.
Which I disagree with the thesis.
I do disagree with it,
I do
but
too.
that is pretty much what you see. I mean, it happening.
It's
Countries
only-
like China.
It's only been 25 years.
That is true. But what I'm
We are
saying is,
seeing
that,
exactly the opposite happening. This ideology is coming back with a
With a
big
vengeance,
revenge.
but ideology is coming in this form, in this form, and not an inclusive, but an exclusive form. The French, the Swedes, the Turks, the Indians, the Egyptians, the Brazilians, the Muslims.
But it's always exclusive and inclusive at the same time. All kinds of ideologies are like that. When you say we are communists, then you are basically
Yeah, but
then you are
it has
immediately
a
also
broader
against
appeal.
against the fascists, right?
In group, out group.
I understand that,
Yeah.
but still, it has a broader appeal. When you appeal to workers, that has a broader appeal. It transcends a lot of other identities.
Yeah.
But I think
That's
workers,
true.
that's where the revolutionary potential has been, eroded, because I don't think, workers in factories, also unionized workers, I don't really think that they identify so much with workers in other countries. I mean, maybe get in a bar and have a drink or something, but
they do.
they're not saying workers of the world unite.
They still
I mean,
do.
there are some. There's always going to be an intellectual left that says
wait,
workers of the
wait,
world
wait,
unite.
I've
There
got
was a good
Where's-
example. There was a good example, I think, a year ago, when I forgot what kind of workers were striking. I mean, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but it was pretty impressive because longshoremen in the U.S. went on strike in solidarity with other workers going on strike in some country that's you wouldn't even think that Americans would know about.
I mean, it does occasionally
I think
happen,
workers
yeah.
do show solidarity.
Yeah.
I think we need to point out that in the industrialized countries, in the developed countries, I should say, we don't have traditional workers anymore to the extent that we had 100 years ago. We have service economy.
Well, there are still factory workers. but
There
yeah,
are still
you're right.
factory
We are
workers.
also workers in the sense that we are also
Exploited.
We are also doing wage labor.
Yeah,
right?
but I mean that dynamic has
Yeah.
been changed, and so we cannot be surprised, that then the whole structure sort of falls apart on the left.
Yeah, well, I mean, where are the service unions? I mean, there must be some service unions somewhere.
France has a lot of them. They strike every other day. That's what
Yeah,
the
but
French are famous for.
where's the international? Where's the EU level service union? Where's the EU level? I mean, I know that in Germany there's a really strong what is it like metal workers union or something like that.
Well,
But
the
is
pilots.
that
there's
Yeah,
service.
pilots. Yeah.
yeah?
I mean, here in
is
Hamburg,
Yeah.
we always get these
What is it called? Verdi?
S-Bahn stoppages
I
because
can't remember their name.
Lufthansa
I know
pilots
that
are striking,
Metal,
or the
Yeah.
S.
Or the
But
Post.
is that just the German union?
Or the Deutsche
Or is-
Post.
Lokführer.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Lokführer striking.
But is that but all these unions we're talking about, they usually, or at least, I mean, I don't know enough to actually say for sure, but it seems like, aren't they constrained to a country? The German iron workers union, or maybe a company, Lufthansa
Well,
pilots, or are those German pilots? I mean, pilots might be one of those that is more international, because pilots are
Multinational
they're
Well,
flying all
that's-
over the goddamn place.
That's again another thing that you can explain with capital is that capital sort of
I
first
agree,
it forced unions first to only worry about maybe hours of working time, working conditions, and wages. And so to have a very, very narrow spectrum of what are the possibilities
That's
for
right.
workers.
And there's only certain times that workers are even allowed to strike now in Germany. Unions can only strike if they meet certain conditions.
Yeah.
And it's like, but that is essentially, just not the case, man. Because it's not like the first time workers in the history got together and had a strike. It's not like they first asked permission to do it. That would have defeated their whole project.
Well, they got shut up by the police anyway.
Exactly. They were not supposed to strike,
Yeah.
but that's why it was an effective form of.
Yeah.
It's not like, please, are we allowed to do this? And this is the kind of erosion that I'm talking about. And yes, it's definitely due to the influence of capital, and maybe also the broader sense of like policy,
Cultural.
cultural too, but also just policy being influenced by the wealthy capitalists. So of course they have an interest to regulate against unions. I mean, in the United States, our unions are significantly weaker than they were just 20 years ago. You know, I mean, you're constantly reading in the news, you know, examples of unions.
Yeah, only
falling apart in the United
11%
States.
of workers are unionized.
Unionized, yeah.
in the
Yeah,
United
well,
States.
That's a German stat or
Well, no, in the United
US.
States.
U.S. stat?
In the Germany, it's going to be a lot higher.
Which is one of the major reasons. I was reading somewhere about one of the major reasons for inequality is the fact that there's no more unionized workers in the States.
Yeah.
They were,
Oh, really?
Yeah, Reagan.
Oh, yeah. Reagan smashed the
Reagan
union.
and Thatcher, you know, they're the real culprits. they're the ones that, you know.
So solidarity is the word, in
Yes.
the face of
Liberty, equality, and fraternity.
fraternity. Yeah.
And for that, I'd like to end this segment. Thank you, Navas.
Thank you, everyone.
Let's go on our break and we'll be back to talk about.
We'll
the
be back to
climate.
talk about COP21 in Paris.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
We're sick and tired of all your lies, your unwillingness to compromise. So we'll take it into our own hands. Educate ourselves and take a stand. We're gonna occupy your street, your house, your bank accounts, your everything, yes, everything. Oh, we're here to occupy. I know we feel it's time we occupy. Hey, yeah. I reckon it's a revolution. When it's all said and done, you will find no place to hide, nowhere to run. Heaven should notice, it's everyone. And we're coming for you. It can't be undone, won't be undone. We're gonna occupy your street, your house, your bank accounts, your everything, yes, everything. Oh, we're here to occupy. I know we feel it's right. It's time to occupy. Hey, I reckon it's a revolution.
So, welcome back to the Moral Economy podcast. Eddie and I will be presenting the recent COP21 conference of parties in Paris, which has was started in December 1st and ended in December 12th, this Saturday. And it ended with 195 signatories, countries signing onto an accord. So this accord has been hailed by Barack Obama as a turning point and an enduring framework, and the mainstream media mimics his optimism with adjectives and describers such as ambitious, historic, a major milestone, a landmark, groundbreaking, etc.
And is this still to be ratified, or does it take
This
immediate effect?
it has been signed and it will be ratified. The media has also obviously shown some measured skepticism. To go into the history of this accord of COP. COP comes from the United Nations Framework Conference on the Climate Change, UNFCCC, which was conceived and implemented at the Rio Earth Summit of 1992. And the first Conference of Parties, or COP1, was held in Berlin in 1995. The Kyoto Protocol, which is probably the most significant thing to come out of the COP, and the thing that most people know about, was drawn at COP3 on the 11th of December 1997, and was first effective in 2005, which is a huge time span, I would say. And it's important to point out that the Kyoto Protocol was not legally binding. It had legal mechanisms for monetary punishment for countries that did not keep to their emission limits, but every country could propose its own reduction targets, and every country could, if unable to reach targets and threatened by punishment, withdraw from the protocol, which is exactly what Canada did under Stephen Harper's government in 2011. Also important to note is that the United States, while it signed the agreement, did not ratify it, citing unfairness of focus of responsibility on developed countries. So even though developed countries are responsible for most greenhouse gas emissions and have historically been the driving forces of climate change, the United States and other countries such as Australia did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol because they felt that developing countries should also take more of a role. Not to be outdone, China and India ratified the protocol but stated that they would not be legally bound to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Between 1997 and 2001, a ratification period sought 55% ratification for the protocol to be implemented. And in this time, countries played global warming werewolf. So does everyone know what werewolf is?
The game?
Yeah, the game.
Yeah.
To explain it to our viewers, it's a game that I first encountered here in Germany, but I've heard that it's actually in the United States as well, wherein a group of people will sit down, and two of them are named secretly werewolves, and the rest are villagers, and then there's a doctor and a seer, but we'll ignore that. And the way the game works is the two werewolves secretly kill one of the villagers, and then the villagers accuse or try to figure out which other villagers are actually werewolves. And the werewolves are sitting there and also accusing other villagers of this. And this is, for me, a very good analogy of the ratification process of the Kyoto Protocol, because in this time, countries sort of started accusing each other of sort of climate treachery in hiding their emissions or going for targets that they weren't actually capable of reaching. The big difference is that in this process, we know exactly who the werewolves are. They're exactly the people who are accusing other countries the most, the United States and China and India. And they are also the greatest emitters. I hope that was a good analogy in order to explain this whole process. To get back to the agreement, I just want I want to say first, the agreement commits countries to limiting greenhouse gases such that we do not have a global rise in temperature above 2 degrees. And in fact, they say well below 2 degrees. And then they encourage countries to also look for a target of 1.5 degrees
So what's the time span?
Celsius. For the 2 degrees, it's 2050, and for the 1.5 degrees, it's 2030 is what you would need to do by then.
I thought the Paris Agreement said as soon as possible.
As soon as possible,
Which
yes.
is very
It's a
problematic.
lot of
Because
wonderful,
what does that mean?
a lot of
It's
wonderful
basically
vague.
not committing to any deadline.
Yeah.
It's touching.
And I just wanted like to point out, I've looked through the agreement, and it's already by environmental groups and climate scientists are already very dissatisfied with the agreement. They're saying statements such as "this is not enough" to "this changes nothing." And one of the big problems is that it does not explicitly set limits. And to sort of give an example of how really vague this language is, I will just quote Article 2, Section 1. Quote, "This agreement, in enhancing the implementation of the Convention, including its objective, aims to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty by including by a holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change." Now hold that in your head, because there's also then Article 7, Section 4, which says, "Parties recognize that the current need for the adaptation is significant and that greater levels of mitigation can reduce the need for additional adaptation efforts, and that greater adaptation needs can involve greater adaptation costs."
Wow.
So,
Enlightening.
yeah, I mean, this is very vague language, just to put it, vaguely, right? Basically, it's saying parties understand that adaptation will be costly and that more adaptation will be more costly, right? I mean, what is
smart.
this? What is this, right? So that's basically the end of my bit. I want to add, as the climate scientists say, we need explicit limits. And we've been going at this for 21 years now, even longer. We've known about this for much longer. And this is all that we can come up with after 21 years. I mean, that should, I don't know, it doesn't surprise me, but it should still enrage everyone. And Eddie, I'd like to hand it over to you now.
Yeah, I guess we talked about this earlier. We segued it in a nice way. I don't know how we did that, but maybe a reason, a motivation as to why a lot of activists and climatologists and environmentalists felt pretty pessimistic even before the COP21 in Paris started was because they knew that big governments and big business interests is just against any kind of limits and any kind of deadlines and any kind of agreements that would drastically change our standards and our requirements to reduce emissions. And part of the reason that is because of the war that unfortunately climate and war play. And so I want to propose a working thesis, and that is that climate change leaves specifically U.S. security interests in a paradoxical position. So with over 1,000 bases, over 1 million troops around the world, the U.S. is the global hegemony. We know this. This is not news to us. It's the most powerful military in world history, and because of it, it is also the largest institutional polluter in the world. To maintain its military might, it must maintain its access to its lifeblood, oil. And to continue to pollute at its current rate, it must safeguard its access to oil. So to quote Alan Greenspan, he was the Clinton head of the Federal Reserve. He said, quote, "I am saddened that it is politically inconvenient to acknowledge what everybody knows. The Iraq War is largely about oil." I think from here it's easy to extend the argument and say that most of the long-waging Middle Eastern wars are in part due for the access of oil. So the paradox is that by continuing to pollute at its rate to maintain global hegemony, it directly contributes to a warming of the earth, which contributes to more conflicts around the world. And as the Pentagon and also the CNA, that is the Center for Naval Analysis, has stated, increase of the warming of the earth will increase also wars, famines, droughts, and of course, terrorism. Now, to support this or to defend this kind of thesis, I would have to argue how the U.S. military pollutes so much. Well, to make that argument is kind of hard because according to the Kyoto 1997 Kyoto Accords, military institutions are exempt from international oversight.
So they're not polluting at all, even if they are, or how does that work?
They're not counted.
Okay, because I think mostly what's discussed is industrial emissions, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And okay, military. I don't know.
Related
They're not
industrial
counted.
complex.
Yeah, military is the
Yeah.
other side of the industrial
Yeah.
complex.
Yeah.
Okay,
And so there are divergent numbers.
that's clever.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now maybe I can get into that. I mean, according to the Paris agreements, they have to start being counted, but it's not really mandatory. So under the Paris Agreement, countries would not be obliged to cut their military emissions, but equally there would be no automatic exemption from them either.
I don't know what that's supposed to mean
Yeah,
either. I
what
mean,
does
that's
that
just
mean?
the same vague language that you know I was mentioning earlier.
So because of this, it's hard to get a real number on it. I mean, there has been research. So, for example, there's one project called the Project Sensor, which was done by a group of student and faculty researchers from different U.S. universities. According to their findings from 2003 to 2007, the Iraq War contributed to 60% of the world's CO2 emissions.
I mean, that's just such a high number that I can't believe it, right? Like, even as skeptical I am of everything that has to do with the military and the United States and all that stuff. Wow.
Yeah. And there was another study done by let's see if I could find this at my wing. They found the same kind of number. It was called, where was it? I can't find it now. Anyways, according to the DoD, the Department, oh, here it is. The Oil Change International Report. The Iraq War is responsible for 141 million tons of carbon releases in its first 4 years, which was on an annual basis more than the emissions from 139 countries in this period. Yeah. So that kind of fits with this other research. According to the DoD, the U.S. Army, so just the Army, emitted more than 70 million tons of CO2 equivalents per year in 2014. But this figure, of course, omits the other branches of the military, primarily the Air Force, which is the largest consumer of jet fuel in the world. And to give you some kind of point of contact of how much the U.S. Air Force consumes, an F-4 Phantom fighter burns more than 1,600 gallons of jet fuel per hour and peaks at 14,400 gallons per hour at supersonic speeds. The B-52 Stratocruiser with 8 jet engines guzzles 500 gallons per minute. 10 minutes of flight uses as much fuel as the average driver does in 1 year of driving. A quarter of the world's jet fuel feeds the United States Air Force fleet. And in 2006, they consumed as much fuel as U.S. planes did during the Second World War, 1941 to 1945. That's 2.6 billion gallons. Yeah. So that's just some statistics to give you guys a point of contact as to how much the U.S. military pollutes. Now, what I found interesting about all this is the clash that we find between the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex. Because I know some of us know, I don't know if all of us know this, but the Pentagon has released tons of data showing how climate change is against American national interests, security interests. So they've released, tons of research, multiple reasons for why Congress should pay attention to climate change. It's increased the national security interests, but change hasn't been made, which is interesting, right? Now, the Pentagon's MO, their mission objective, is the security of the U.S. and its citizens. But the military-industrial complex, all businesses that profit from war, their MO is profit maximization, right? And climate change is good business for the military-industrial complex. I would argue the reason Congress hasn't been aggressive enough for appropriate climate legislation is because of the role the military-industrial complex and big oil has had in lobbying Washington. They pay big bucks.
Yeah.
So this past August, we had the budgets released. I forgot the numbers. I think the military budget was decreased a handful of $1 billion less to $600 billion. We'd have to fact check that, but I think that's what the number was. And the military-industrial complex alone sent 400 defense lobbyists, offering literally millions of dollars to congressmen to vote their way, right? Now, how do businesses profit from climate change? Now, I have a few quotes here from big defense institutions like Raytheon. Another one from the British Minister of State for Strategic Defense Acquisition Reform, Lord Drayson, where he says, I think climate change is a real opportunity for the aerospace and defense industry. Yeah. Raytheon, big producer of military-grade weapons, missiles, so on and so forth, they said that last year that, quote, expanded business opportunities are likely to arise as consumer behavior and needs change in response to climate change. The company also expects to see, quote, demand for its military products and services as security concerns may arise as results of droughts, floods, and storm events occur as a result of climate change. Now, we know, I hope we know, maybe some of us have heard about how the Syrian civil war in many ways was caused by climate change, right? So severe droughts, food prices skyrocketed. This caused rural communities to go to urban ones. Urban communities were overwhelmed. Citizens sought redress for their grievances, and of course they were met with violent oppression, which turned then to armed conflict. Now there's a lot of research on this. You could easily Google it.
I think it's important to say it's a leading factor in climate change was a leading factor in the Syrian conflict.
It wasn't at the sole cause.
Yeah, not the cause. Yeah.
Right. Or maybe it was multi-causal.
It's multicultural, yeah.
Now, because of this, there's been a lot of research in the last few years trying to connect climate change and violence, and there's a lot of hard evidence. Most recently, there was a research published on Science Magazine. Science Magazine is, if not one of the top peer-reviewed journals in the world, Science and Nature. These are top magazines, and there they show the not only anthropologically, as we were talking about earlier, Andrew, with how many empires have fallen as a result of changes in climate, but also recently, where they did a research, they did a study with police officers, where they put them up in situations where they would have to deal with aggressive aggressors and
Behavior?
yeah, sorry.
Aggressive behavior?
Yeah, aggressive behavior with aggressors, and the ones that were in warmer areas were more likely to fire their pistol. Yeah, and so there's a lot of connection between increasing climate and violence. And if you give me 1 second, I can quote.
One.
One passed already, and I'm not. Okay. So, yeah, I'm not finding this at the moment. I got the jitters because I'm live on the air. Here we go. Okay. So, the study found general agreement amongst case studies that with exceptionally high and low rainfall, for example, particularly when it impacts agricultural production, can lead both to interpersonal and intergroup violence. I think Syria here is a good example. But even looking at only at scientists' projections for future temperature increases. The statistical rise in violent tendencies is significant enough, the study claims, that amplified, and this is a quote from the study, amplified rates of human conflict could represent a large and critical impact of anthropogenic climate change. In other words, it's something we might need to prepare for, just like rising seas or nastier wildfires. Yeah.
I want to add an example to that. I mean,
Yeah.
not many people know about this, but there's a huge fence between Bangladesh and India that the
definitely.
Indians are putting up because they know that the Bangladeshis are going to be fleeing climate change, and
they're
also
gonna be in that
because
area.
there's going to be more
It's
conflict.
just I mean, Maldives is not going to exist as a country.
Yeah, the Maldives
Yeah,
won't
Maldives is
exist.
not going to exist as a country if the current rising sea levels continue. I think about in another maybe 30 years or so, it's not going to exist as a country if this continues. Bangladesh is already that whole region, Bay of
Yeah.
Bengal, has severe monsoons, and while as this conference was going on, southern India had Chennai had one of the worst floods that it's ever seen. We saw that thing as well. One of the leading newspapers that was being published for the past 120 years did not
The
publish.
Hindu,
The Hindu was not published because there was so much water in Chennai.
In Chennai, yeah.
And there was smog in Beijing. You know, these are happening right when.
And not to go
conferences.
so far to India. I mean, in Hungary, they're putting up fences as well to keep refugees in. As long as we understand that global warming is also a driving force of refugees or of the creation of refugees.
conflicts, and then people are fleeing
And
conflicts.
even in Europe, we're seeing also these sort of things happening.
So I don't think it's hard to make the argument that climate and violence are linked.
Yeah.
I don't think it's hard at all to make that kind of argument. I guess the curiosity for me is that what has to be done, at least in the U.S., and I talk about the U.S. not only because I'm from there, but because it's the global hegemony. I mean, what happens in the U.S. is going to have effects all over the world. Between big industry and national security interests. Because now Congress seems to be pretty convinced that we have to keep doing what we're doing because it's good for the economy. But by continuing, by doing this, we're going to increase climate change, which is going to create more, not only, the much feared terrorism that's all over the news, but everything else. The worst things, famine, droughts, civil wars, so on and so forth.
I think it's a very good point that you make or bring up that it's something that I might have thought about but never really investigated is the influence of the war industrial complex on policy and on the reason why we can't just tackle climate change. If we don't only have oil interests stop lobbying government in order to stop the substantial changes, but also the war industrial complex doing that. I mean, it's kind of actually no wonder that we've come to a standstill almost.
Yeah, but they work hand in hand.
Yeah.
Oil provides
Yeah, exactly,
fuel to
exactly.
all industries.
It's like we all focus on the oil, and yet there is the big elephant in the room.
Yeah, it is the big
right?
elephant. Yeah.
And this might be, I have a stat that I want to read out to you guys, which might be, to me, in my mind, an argument that a lot of these military-industrial complex lobbyists use, or big oil uses to congressmen. And it's an economic argument where they say, look, 10 of the 11 U.S. recessions since World War II have been preceded by oil price spikes. Maintaining low and stable oil prices is a political imperative associated with modern petroleum-based economies.
Yeah.
And that if we want a good economy, we have to maintain oil and our control over oil.
Yes, but this is 70s research, when we already know that we are going to run out of oil.
Yeah.
And we cannot depend on oil as
Yeah.
the world economy in general, not just the US. We cannot depend on oil
Yeah, but that's
as a reliable source of fueling our lives.
That's the game that they're playing, though. I mean, they realize eventually countries, but specifically also armies, are going to have to go to green energy. And what happens when all armies in all countries have access to green energy and no longer have to depend on oil in order to be successful? Then they no longer have their hegemonic power over these regions in the first place, which they need in order to have the oil. So it's actually feeds into itself.
Right.
At some point, it's going to hit a very critical point where we have to transition over. And that's the real question is what is going to happen at this sort of 0 point?
Yeah, but are we prepared for that? I mean, do we wait
No,
that
we
long?
no we
to that
shouldn't. We
point
shouldn't.
Where
We shouldn't.
we
I
have
mean,
no other option but to move to this.
yeah, but I mean, and my point is that they don't want you to go to green energy now because that's a big
You still have
loss,
oil, yeah. I
a big
understand.
loss for them,
There's
right?
a lot of money put in oil.
Yeah.
There's a lot of money put in the technology that runs on oil, and in
Well,
researching
and the
technology.
industrial war industrial complex also a big loss for them as well because that would be
Of course.
it would be a peaceful era if we had green energy, dudes.
But again, as this goes also cyclical in the sense that if this is going to, and this is also something that is being discussed and agreed across, I think, scientific community, at least in political science, that they foresee conflicts, increased conflicts, already in territories which are under resource pressure, which are like the global
Yeah.
south, where you have a lot of populations, a lot of mouths to feed, dwindling water resources.
Well, you might know about this because I've read this. I don't find it on my notes now, but how the droughts have increased tensions between Indians and Pakis.
Definitely, they have. Like India and Pakistan have a conflict in Kashmir where the water for the Indus originates, and if that somehow dries up, that the whole conflict has a center in terms of the water resource that generates most of the agriculture produced in both the countries,
Right.
which provides for the raw material for the industries. Which is why you have, I don't know, if both the militaries are combined together, they have more than 3 million or at least 2 million soldiers, which makes them probably the largest military.
Right.
Yeah, combined.
Combined, yeah.
And there's nuclear warheads on both sides and all that kind of nonsense. And definitely there's, like I said, in countries like India, China, Bangladesh, Pakistan, the global south, where you have large populations and where you're already feeling the consequences of this, like seawaters are rising, a lot of land is not anymore agricultural.
Yeah.
It could not be used for agrarian purposes because seawaters are rising, and you cannot. Like I know people personally who had to give up agriculture on their land because the underground water was becoming brackish. It was becoming increasingly salty, and you cannot grow food over there. You cannot grow crops over there. And it's only as much. I mean, the limits of the economy to grow on its own within the services and the industrial sectors are limited. It does the way industry is designed in these countries is that they rely on agriculture inputs as their raw materials. Now this is a major cause of poverty as soon as your grains, staple dietary whatever fibers, rice, wheat, they become expensive, raw materials become expensive. Wages go down. So this is, a cycle that produces nation state conflicts and within nation states. In this example of India and Pakistan, yeah.
And for me, this just highlights the importance of the left to monopolize not only the anti-war kind of camp, but also the climate camp. I said, look, this is the same struggle.
Yeah, bring them together.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the same struggle. And big, local social movements have to be made. And I think 2016 is going to be a big year.
It's going to go
for
down.
For grassroots movements. And what that means is that everyone has to get involved, even if they're not experts. Because look, we're not experts. We're just interested and we try to contribute a bit. But I think it's important that everyone, even people listening, us, ourselves, to just go out on the street and just get a little more involved with our local organizations, with whatever, and try to combine all these things because they are intertwined. Military, oil, big business, the environment. And we're seeing it with the environment. And maybe this can be our saving grace because we actually see it in our day-to-day lives. Like, look, I can't get the same freaking good tasting apples that I used to get. That's something small, but hey, that bothers me, and I want to do something about it.
Yeah, that's true. And I think what makes environment even more tricky is that it's a global public good. We all
It's part of the commons.
yeah, it's part of the commons, which is why you have vague languages.
Just to explain the problem with the commons. If we remember our economics, the tragedy of the commons wasn't that the commons was open to everyone, so every farmer maximized their land. No, at that time, when it was open to everyone owned it. They also regulated it through communal, arrangements. And the real tragedy of the commons is when the commons are divided, and then people own it, and then they feel like, oh, I can maximize what I'm doing. Well, the same thing is going to be happening with our environment as well. It is already happening.
It already happened. Yeah.
It's already happening with our environment as well. And that's the tragedy of it, is that the people who actually need that stuff don't own it. And the people who sort of profit from it own it, and really don't care very much as well. What happens?
Yeah. Well, to me, that just highlights also the problem with the concept of private property, which is different than the concept of personal possessions.
Yeah.
People listening, right? Private property is the idea that you own something and you can
Manipulate it.
Expropriate surplus value.
This is a really good thing, because I actually wanted to present the question: what would the moral economy do in order to tackle climate change, in order to tackle the problems on anti-war, but also the rise of the right? Like what when we have concepts of the moral economy, we have sort of concepts of how things would be different. So, for instance, we might have more democracy in our workplaces, and so we'd be less dissatisfied with our working conditions, but also with our wages, because we would be the ones paying, participating in these, and so we might already then mitigate the rise of the right, in that sort of sense. They might see conservative leftists, which there were 100 years ago. Unions used to be very, very conservative in many respects. They used to be very almost xenophobic, but still, we would mitigate a lot of these problems on that side. And on the other side, the WSTEs, or however you have it, communal democratic participation. When we tackle climate change, if we have the power to vote on something and have it done in our communities, we're much more likely to do it than if we use these old avenues of enacting change through representatives.
Yeah, that's why I'm a big fan of very local movements like Chell here, who's getting involved with urban gardens. I think it's a great idea. And if it's, as maybe as trite or tacky as it might sound, I think the UN had a pretty good motto: think globally, act locally. Yeah. And that means it's like, okay, you have to think about world solutions, but at the same time, you can't really, change whatever's going on in the White House. You can partially, but act in your own local community.
Yeah.
Have a little more of independence in your local community. I think that's great.
That goes back to, a lot of our sentiments as well. We should be focused on us helping other people. Like, what can I as an individual do to help other people, not what can I as an individual, or who can I as an individual elect in order to enact policies, in order to help
change things.
Yeah, change things. We sort of need to change the culture in order to understand, that change comes from you, mostly. Like, change in your life will most significantly come from your own actions or inaction, and we shouldn't rely on other people to change things for us.
I think at least while we're on that note, at least the first instance, this is more relevant in the case of climate change, that we participate in whatever national polities which are responsible at the international level in global government institutions like the UN, which make decisions on such things. What we could do as whatever participants and citizens of representative of whatever polities we're a part of, we can somehow participate in the process that makes our representatives in these institutions accountable not just to our interests, but to interests of the whole society of nations, the whole community of mankind.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. That was the cosmopolitan in me.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So.
Well, do you guys have any?
Oh yeah, no, that's what I wanted to mention. Well, kind of going off back to what you were saying, I think that's what we all really agree with in our group here. We consider ourselves to be Epicureans.
Yeah.
And a big thing about
the Epicurious,
being Epicurious or Epicureans, is that we see big, or at least the first step in change to be a very personal thing.
Yeah.
And that, of course, extends over to our friends, our smaller group of friends, and then it extends a little further out into our neighborhoods, and that further out to our communities. And so the importance of living, I guess, an ethical life, right? But not only that, how that ethics connects to our politics.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's more than just this, you know, sort of misattributed quote of "be the change you want to see in the world," which everyone thinks comes from Gandhi, but actually it's sort of like an anonymous quote. It's more than just this idea of, okay, I want to change the world, and so I'm going to be that change. It's like you once you start changing yourself, you start also changing your relationship with the world and how things affect you as well. And so once you maybe sort of change your relationship to, say, your workplace, then your relationship to politics as well will be significantly changed. Because as soon as I can see, oh, I can get things done at my workplace, you know, I can enact really good change with, you know, with the people who are around me in my workplace that improves all of our lives. You look at the political system then. What's that? You know, really, this whole idea of changing really needs to come from you, but it will also then affect how you relate to everything else.
Yeah. It's already, I mean, it's the individual is always connected with the social.
Yeah, we are social animals, as
yeah,
Aristotle said. Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Political animals, that's what he said.
Political animals, yeah.
Yeah.
But definitely, I mean, you're a social animal,
Yeah.
but you're a political animal, but
Absolutely.
yeah, political animal.
Yeah, that implies thought, right? It's
Absolutely.
institutional politics, right?
All right, this is descending into
Which
philosophy,
is great.
ancient philosophy, which is a wonderful, but it's for, I think, another podcast.
Yeah.
Guys, I want to thank you all for
Thank you.
you know, sticking through this for 10 podcasts. I'm really proud of all of you.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening. If
Thank you
you've
for
heard
listening.
all of our other podcasts.
Please like our Facebook page, The Moral Economy. We've never actually mentioned that on the podcast. You know,
We got a Facebook page.
it shows the organizational ability
we have
of. I have a YouTube thing, you know, but you know, I'll cut that all out anyway. So
Fuck
thank you.
YouTube.
Yeah.
Hey, ho, hey, ho, hey, ho, hey, ho, hey, ho, hey, ho, hey. We're here to occupy. I know it, feel it's time. We occupy, occupy. I reckon it's a revolution. Oh yeah, I know it, feel it's time. It's time we occupy, occupy. I reckon it's a revolution.
Yeah, fuck you all. Bye.
Fuck you, Facebook too.
Yeah, fuck Facebook.
Fuck Reddit.
Should we do a proper goodbye? Because you're gonna cut that all out.
United States played a big role in the demise of the left in Europe.
I'm recording.
There was,
True facts.
I mean, the left had gained a lot of support during the Second World War within Europe.
Of course.
The resistance movements in Italy, in France, in Spain, these were really big. Also in Germany, even against the Nazis. And with the Marshall Plan, United States also imposed political limitations on Europeans themselves. That it did not allow any communist or left-wing party to be a member in any government in Europe.
And the excuse was Soviet Union.
Yeah. Especially in Italy, the Communist Party, PC, the PCI,
Mm-hmm.
they got at average 30% of the
Yeah.
votes throughout the 70s.
Yeah.
And they were never allowed to enter a coalition with any government in Italy.
Mhm.
That's why gradually the support declined because people saw that there is no hope in voting for the left-wing parties. And then you have the end of the Cold War. You have the declarations of
Neoliberal
victory for capitalism and the
That's
West
right.
and everything. And then the whole dichotomy of communism versus capitalism disappeared. It was not in the news anymore. People did not hear about it anymore.
George Friedman, for example, even talked of the whole European coal and steel community, the EU as being, America's foreign policy projects to keep Europe in check, to keep Europe from, teaming up with the Soviet Union, especially the Germans, That is what he said, that has been the only foreign policy goal of the US to keep German technology away from Russian resources, natural resources.
And they also established a monopoly to introduce free market.
So
Guys, should we go over to the second segment?
so I'm gonna